pleased to have everybody here. I know it's very crowded. Ken and I have talked about it. We just, even though it's crowded, we feel like it would be a whole different event if we had it in a lecture hall on campus.
This is very European.
So,
you will be mercifully short.
No need to get insulted.
No, we didn't want to go there.
We're so pleased to welcome you to our home, and I wanted to point out to you that the works of art are on loan from the Dishman. Dennis fixed us up. We're talking to Dennis. Maybe we needed a change out on our art, but I
We'll
don't
do
know
that
that
right now.
John Alexander is such a wonderful painting. And by the way, this is one of our alums, Lamar alums. It's John Alexander. So I'm going to brag on us, Kim. So we are so excited because we also have a new piece of artwork. If you haven't seen it yet, it's on the quad. And of course the booth ends problem. But there are little places. It's in front of Lucas. So if you can orient yourself to get down in the quad side of Lucas, we have a James Searles, and we're just thrilled. It just went in Monday, Tuesday. It's so it's a very organic piece of work, and it like grows out of the ground. Anyway, so now we have two of our most influential Texas sculptors on campus. We have the Morales and James Searles. So we're very excited, and as well, it kind of leads into our discussion today, which is poetry and the creative mind. Now, when I read this, I think that I imagine a picture of a brain and wondering, like, are there hot spots on this brain that makes it the creative mind? I don't know.
That's your question.
Anyway, I'm very pleased to have Jerry Bradley here. He is a poet and a member of our English faculty, and Keith Carter, an internationally renowned photographer, been on campus for a long time. So, you guys, we're so lucky to have you both. So, with no further ado, I guess I should just tell you that today's conversation is going to be a back and forth kind of conversation. If you've come before, sometimes we have one speaker who speaks and leads into another. So, we do have to do different things. And, but it will be followed by Q&A. So.
Well, we're going to break the rules right away because you're genteel and you won't get mad at us to our faces. So we might ask you some questions too, because there's not a soul in this room that's not a creative person. Poetry is what we're hanging this on, but creativity is the big enchilada. So this is Dr. Jerry Bradley, who's a legend here, been here 17 years. His students call him Dr. Bradley. I call him Homie. You can call him Homie too. So. And he's won every single well-deserved award from the university, Distinguished Faculty Lecturer, University Professor Award, the Piper Award, which is the top 10 professors in the state, all for good reason. He's a wonderful teacher and a wonderful fellow. And he's published 8 volumes, or 8 books, 4 of which are full-length poetry series. And I've been a fan for years, so, but we haven't become friends, but relatively recently, because we're on different parts of this growing campus. So that's a good thing. So anyway.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I haven't been around so many friends since my last intervention. Try not to disappoint you. It's my turn now to reintroduce Keith. The Los Angeles Times called him a poet of the ordinary, but he's an extraordinary photographer, and we're going to see some of that. A recipient of the Texas Medal of Arts, the author of 11 books, He's got a 50-year career retrospective coming out soon from the University of Texas Press. Work's been featured on CBS Sunday Morning. Lots of prizes. The Lange Taylor Prize from the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. His work can be found in the Art Institute of Chicago, the National Portrait Gallery, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the J. Paul Getty Museum, Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the George Eastman House, the Whitliff Collections in San Marcos. And he has a few teaching awards too. He's endowed chair in the Department of Art. He's received the Regents Professor Award and Distinguished Faculty Lecture Prize. We agreed he's going to start off with something, and we're going to.
Oh, I thought we were through right there. All right, I still spend, even in this technological digital age, I still spend hours a week in a dark room. I spend hours a week in front of a computer too, but I still use a dark room. And being old school, I have a wall, and many creative people do. And on that wall are jokes that people have sent me, things that people have sent me, postcards, things that help me try to stay focused. On that wall, I have a number of sayings. One is, we live at the level of our language. Whatever we can articulate, we can imagine, develop, and explore. Arkansas writer Ellen Gilchrist. Let me do that again. We live at the level of our language. Whatever we can articulate, whatever we can talk about, we can explore that idea, etc., etc. Talk about it. The soul always begins a thought with an image. Aristotle. I have a number of things, and the one I really love is the poet Wallace Stevens, who said, poetry must almost successfully resist intelligence. Let me do that again. I, as a young man being self-taught, every time I'd read the word poetry, which I always loved, I'd change the word to photography, which I deeply love. And Stevens says, poetry must almost successfully resist intelligence. And I tell myself, okay, my pictures, it's okay. They must almost successfully resist intelligence. So on that note, I would like to ask Jerry, would you tell how we met years ago?
Right here in Beaumont.
No, you were drinking. You know. It was in Houston.
I can't remember the name of the restaurant or where that was, but this was for the Texas Association of Creative Writing Teachers, and he was featured. He was our banquet speaker. And you tell him what you challenged us to do.
Well, I showed 10 photographs, you know, projection slideshows in those days, and I said, here's one. I want you to, it's this one right here. I said, you're all writers. You got pencils and paper on your desk. Why don't you take 3 minutes and write a poem? That's your little test. The name of the photograph on your right is Megan's New Shoes. It's a little girl exploding, wearing new shoes. And you want to take it from there?
Okay. And of course, I didn't write my poem in 3 minutes. There are people who did. It took me a while.
Well, I gave y'all some slack.
Came up with a poem, and he didn't give us anything more than the pictures, so I didn't know exactly who this young girl was. And, I presumed an occasion and wrote the following poem, which is called, maybe you want to hold that up while maybe that'll direct them back to it. This is called Megan's New Shoes. I wonder where I got that. That wasn't very creative.
Well, I think it's a good title, personally. That's her name.
Steal from the best. That's my motto.
One on your right, little girl blowing up.
Okay.
I'll tell you that story later.
When smoke relaxes, it comes back, tired of leaving the world. Its top opens like present string and falls away. When light wakens, it falls all at once, grown in the flash of its first moment. On my birthday, I rose like smoke, aching to be grown. But when the light of these Mexican sparklers folded, I fell back like gravity into the world and into my new shoes.
Wow.
And then years later, I found out he published it.
Now, I'll do another quick photography poem. It's a sonnet. And for those who think poems should rhyme, this one will do that. Although you may not hear them all, but trust me, the rhymes are there. This is one called, I lived where Jerry Cravenbeck here and I were colleagues at West Texas A&M. And next to us was one of the big slaughterhouse towns in Texas called Hereford, appropriately enough. And so this poem is part thinking of West Texas cattle and Gary Larson. Remember Gary Larson, the Far Side cartoons? You know, you always that whenever people are around, you suspect the cows are standing up talking to one another. This is called photographing the cows. Now, I had posed a question to Keith before this that he didn't want to answer. I said something about Heisenberg's theory that a watched object is changed by being observed, and he said, I don't want to talk about that.
Do you understand that? Do it again.
But it doesn't happen when people look at a poem. A poem, you know, it's when they're being looked at, you know.
Don't try and explain that theory to me.
Changes if it knows it's under observation.
I'm more interested in the process. Go ahead.
That's why we have all those cameras on campus. And as I said, I quit having sex in the office the first day that we So it does change your behavior. This is photographing the cows. In this landscape, they have meteors for eyes, not blazing, but ones that have hit earth and cooled. Heads up like heavy lanterns, they stand and gaze at you, improvising thought, tails churning flies. One skull seems not enough. This outcrop they graze is as blank as frost scrawl or loaves of bread. All doubt fades before hooves and horn, is not fooled by the sounds of wind on wheat, on grasses. They smile, but they do not need your curving lens. There's nowhere for them to go, won't say cheese. They browse, but are not led. Ignore what passes, are the negative your shot snaps. And their prints pucker and pleat, gather, wander where they please, trail to water, the sky they fell from like lead. Now I'm going to throw it back to Keith, but I want a question we talked about, and I try to tell my poetry writing students is, I don't know about photography, but it's true about most poetry, most literature exists more in time than space. There are a few noted examples. Whitman is more of a spatial poet. William Carlos Williams. We have the Imagist poets. Anyone influenced by haiku, senryu, and those sorts of things. There's sort of frozen instance. But most poems, and we talk about words like movement of a poem or pivot in a poem, and we feel like, at least emotionally, we've ended up somewhere different at the end than we did at the beginning. So I think poetry is largely a temporal art. Even though it may contain a lot of visual images, but is there any kind of parallel in the plastic arts and photography?
I have to tell you that I don't think like that, and and I hate to say this in front of such a scholarly group, but those theories don't really help me get the work done. I think they're important in a scholarly way, but they don't help me in a practical way. And I don't think about what's temporal or spatial. I think about it after I do it. And in my world, when I'm looking, I try, and if I'm drawn in any way, shape, or form to something, I make the picture. I don't dwell on it, and I don't think those deep, deep thoughts at that time. And I tell myself, just make the picture. You have the rest of your life to figure out what it means. So that doesn't help you, but it helps me. And the point here is everybody has a different way of approaching your art or your life, shall we say. My colleague Prince Thomas, who I dearly love, sitting back there on the right, is a younger, and he's conceptual thinking photographer. He's a magnificent teacher. And yesterday, or day before yesterday, we were having thesis defenses on graduating photography students. And we were walking around looking at the work, and I said, I really like that. And he said, I hate that. And I said, you're not supposed to say that about student work. He said, I just hate that. We ought to take it out. And I said, no. And I said, well, what do you like? And he said, I like that. And I said, oh, God, I hate that. But then we started doing just exactly what he was talking about. We start deconstructing. Why? You know, why? I can do that as an afterthought. I don't let the facts get in the way of telling the truth in the beginning. You know, let's just throw the ingredients in and move some things around.
In some aspect in the moment of creation, there's a dissatisfaction with the world.
Possibly.
It's something that's presenting itself, and we like art because it's better or different than the world we know. The world is not enough. That's certainly possible, and I'm sure that's happened in my case. But I think if I were a writer, I like the celebratory aspects of living on this planet. I really like the idea of, I know things are S-H-I-T-T-Y. I understand that, but not always. And the small things, and that's what we try to impart to students, you know, particularly your own life. The small things, that's where your poems come from. You're not really talking about grand issues in a lot of those. You're talking about cows. Yeah. But you're also talking about grand issues through the cows. Is that fair? Yes, because we're trying to make some sense of the world. We don't like the notion that the world has no meaning. It may not have any meaning, but the artist is going to try, at least for a moment, like a magic trick. See that? Look at a particular one.
Well, let me ask you this, because I've asked about 8 different people in the last few days, what is creativity? You know, and you can't believe the BS I've heard. Or the skirting the issues, you know, because for something so simple, whether it's in business or in the arts or the literary world or the world of dance, it's hard to define. I mean, it's a nebulous thing. I've spent 50 years practicing my craft and trying to evolve in my craft and keeping abreast of what's going on in the art world. And I can tell you pretty much what I know about creativity if they ask me that question in about 40 seconds. And then I wouldn't know what else to say. Because the rest of it, in my experience, and this may be a personal thing, is really mysterious and sometimes deeply personal. Prince, do you?
Completely agree.
Do you?
Yeah.
And you're a conceptual man. Okay, so, well, you guys make up your own mind. I mean, there's no one way to view these things, but
there aren't many original ideas, so that's not what we're talking about with creativity.
No, not at all.
It says there are 5 subjects for literature: time, death, life, love, and scenery. That's it.
Yeah.
You know, and how we rearrange the scene.
Well, yeah.
But there are ways to be creative. In a poem, you can be creative with a rhyme scheme, or try to resuscitate a word that might be in danger of falling out of the lexicon, or an unusual image to think in another way.
Well, in Western music, there are 12 notes, 1 octave. Play piano, start C, you know, blah, 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 D flat, but go up 12 notes. Everything in Western music you love are made with those same 12 notes. If you play the blues, that's the minor pentatonic scale. That's 5 notes. That's the same thing he's talking about. B.B. King, Eric Clapton, you name it. J.J. Cale, 5 notes. It's not the notes so much as how you play those notes. And I think the thing I love about great poets, they teach me things because it interests me what they see in sometimes things that are so minute, and then there's some surprise where I'm evolved in some sort of way. And that helps me in my own work. It's a selfish
Well, that's what I'm talking about. The movie.
selfish
You
thing.
feel differently at the end with a work of art sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
We hope to.
Yeah.
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 I don't know how that works exactly in photography, because it's all, maybe my focus is, I'm in the right place to be literature, you know.
Well,
If I were a photographer, I'd just go around and start taking pictures of everything, I guess.
well, let's forget you're a poet, and let's forget I'm a photographer. Let's just talk about looking, you know. And then how do you process what you look at? What do you care about? Who do you love? What are you disposed to think of? You know, what significance do you see in what you look at? That, I mean,
Are you seeking a response to that question?
yes.
Sure.
Could I ask? Would you respond?
I would.
Are you going to bring up Deep Purple?
No.
Okay. That was his favorite group in college, by the way.
It seems to me that when I was overseeing doctoral dissertations, that the single greatest constraint of a student really making a contribution was their ability to function in the abstract. And that's the ability to remove themselves from the structure of the training and begin to see pictures in what they were looking at, the phenomena in a different way. But when they're constrained by the structure, then the abstract didn't happen, and the piece was flat. And many of those students never finished.
That's great. Yeah.
It's just one view. I mean, everybody in
No.
here is creative,
That's great.
and they do it in whatever their respective field is, and they, somehow you've got to be able to fashion some kind of contribution in your field, and that has to come from somewhere.
What are the attributes of creativity? Give me one. I asked my friend Christopher, who can draw like a god. What's an attribute? I won't ask my friend David, because he'll be like Buddha, and he'll just give you an oblique angle.
Originality or unexpectedness, or something.
Unexpectedness? Anybody?
Le Corbusier in a lecture at Columbia said that creativity is gathering of the ether.
Is what?
Gathering of the ether.
Gathering of the ether. Well, that's nebulous in itself. Thank goodness. Well, you know.
Beginning with the Romantic movement, creativity has largely come to mean things that haven't been done before.
Yeah.
And if you go to a
Business is
modern
innovative.
art museum, you see strange sculptures and that sort of thing, and so see how original that is. It's only in the last couple of 100 years that we have valued originality as we do.
Well, that's true.
Romantics.
Or even had museums as we know them. So, yeah,
Before that,
that's
people
relatively
were looking
new.
backward to the classics and trying to assess how far away we've fallen.
Well, you know, on a practical note, do you walk around with a notebook in your pocket?
I will have a phone you can take notes on. And
A contemporary notebook in your pocket.
But there are certain places. If I go to a professional conference and there are a lot of writers, I have paper always, because I'll come away with some ideas based on, or some topics, or maybe just a word.
Well,
and, add water, makes a poem.
to soothe your theoretical soul on occasion, go back to Aristotle, the soul always begins a thought with an image. And that makes me think about, when you write a poem, do you begin with a word, or do you begin with an image?
It works different ways, but often it could be an image. You know, Faulkner did, began A Sound in the Fury with a novel of a little girl with muddy underpants up in a tree. And spun that whole novel out of that image, you know, so that certainly they're very powerful. And I said, I like to see images in poems and try to get my students to.
Do you think in terms of words? Do you think in terms of images before you put the word on the paper? I'm looking right at you, baby. Word, not the image. Smart young man back there.
I go for images.
You go for images, yin and yang. Yeah.
There are certain words, there's And it's sort of off limits to say, well, Keats used that word so well. You know, they just appropriated it. But if you come up with your own words, you
I wonder if because you're talking about artistic process, which may be different than creativity, but it seems to me that those who do creative things probably don't even ask the question, they just do it.
Yeah.
And if you ask yourself, it's like the centipede who can't move their head or something like that.
And you know, you have to make yourself take pictures and write poems. I know everybody wants them to come. Just like you see people used to be on street corners playing air guitar, hoping the Rolling Stones would come by for their next guitarist. But I mean, you have to do something for this to happen, and you have to, through way of opening up to whatever it is, the muses or luck or.
That's the question I would have. I mean, is it labor? Is it work? Is it lunch pail? You take your lunch pail to work, and are you waiting for some inspirational moment to
Oh, I love that question, but let me throw it back to you. I'll be glad to answer that. What do you think?
I think you probably wait for the inspirational moment.
Yeah. What's wrong? David Cargill, one of the great sculptors who, bless his heart, has stayed in this town. Are you the one that told me what work is? What is it? The quote?
If you show up to work, anything can happen.
Yeah. Mostly you work. You know, mostly you put. Sometimes you push materials around, and you just. If you wait like St. Paul on the road to Damascus to be struck by light, in a creative manner, you're just going to wait forever. You know what happens if you get in a dry period, and it happens to all artists, and I'm sure you know in your world too. The only way I know of to really get out of that is get back to work, because it's in the working that something happens, not while you're sitting there Buddha-like trying to assimilate cosmic dust. It happens while you're working. I believe that to be true.
It seldom comes in a pure form.
Yeah. I want to show you
the notion of trying to just tune in and write it down or take it.
That's my photograph of Keats. The poet John Keats, dead. Deceased. It's not a great picture, but I love it. Done in Rome.
Is that
it's his death. It's his death mask in his house. Yeah.
And they let you take the picture.
No, they didn't.
Oh.
For those of you who are students, let me point out, in my profession, this is useful. Never ask permission. Ask forgiveness. I'm so sorry. I didn't know.
Can I make a point about Jerry Bradley's work ethic? Because I did an interview with you for the art studio, and I asked you about the difference in unrhymed and rhymed poetry. And your answer didn't surprise me. Do you remember what you said?
No. But today I might say I didn't have time enough not to make it rhyme. Because that's the way some students think. They think every poem should the line should end with a rhyme.
Well, this is what you said. You said, as soon as it looks like the poem is demanding rhyme, I don't want to do it anymore. And I said, why? And you said, because that's hard. That's too much.
Or it's forced sometimes. Sometimes you know, I mean, I certainly write in rhyme. Let me see if I have one here.
Yeah, read another poem, please.
Here's a poem that rhymes. It's called, I got into, and it sort of fed into one another. I've been working on one series of poems about carnival midways. And another, we had 3 grandsons visiting us, and started reading them the Grimm's fairy tales, which they loved. The original Grimm's fairy tales, because they're all bloody, and the boys loved that. And I started talking about it afterwards. And so I've been doing lots of poems about fairy tales. Some of them are updated anyway. But this poem is sort of a cross breed, but it's called The Haunted House. The haunted house always keeps its lights on. It's where the woman who resembles your mother sits and mends. Welcome, she says, come in. What kind of man could resist? It is the place he goes when he's tired of not fitting in. Welcome, she says. Look at what the wind blew in. But the bedrooms are empty now, and it's too late to worry about ghosts or the weather. As pointless as trying to sew eggs back together. He knows what happened here, knows where everyone is gone. The haunted house always keeps its lights on.
Oh, that's nice. Well, may I show a quick photograph then? 30 years ago, I did this book, and it's called From Uncertain to Blue. And it wasn't a deep, abiding idea, but I wanted to go with my wife to 100 small communities that have peculiar names in the state of Texas. Places like Diddy Wah Diddy, Blue, Uncertain, et cetera, et cetera. And one place I went to was poetry. That's this one with the column. Okay? I made that 30 years ago. Poetry is not full of poets. Poetry is full of mean-ass goat farmers. And I do not kid you that. Do you understand my colloquialism? Okay, all right. But point of that is, there wasn't anything to photograph by normal standards that would make people look. But because I had an affection for poets like Jerry, I looked at the column on one of those houses and I thought about the house. You don't really care so much about that, but I thought about the history of that house. And if I were a writer, I would write what William Goyen wrote, House of Breath. All the things that could happen in a house. The love, the deaths, the births, you know, the histories, the feuds, everything. And which is why I photographed a column. And which is why everybody thinks I'm nuts about stuff like that, you know. Why that? Why not something important? You got to guard against perfection on occasion, except in the university world. You want to be as perfect as you can, okay?
You're talking about, I'll interject here. Everybody knows the Texas Country Reporter, right?
Oh, yeah.
I do a fairly good Bob Phillips imitation, but not so much Kelly. But, you know, it's on twice a week. It's repeated once. He goes all around the state, looking up interesting things.
He came to see me too. I love your poem about it.
Yeah, I'm about to get into that. This poem I'm about to read, there's a website I would direct you to. All the, it's recorded at TCU. The interviewer is a faculty member at Texas Women's University in Denton, and the original project was to have interviews with all the living Texas poet laureates. And that's how it started, and they try to do one a month. And one of the things the poet does, besides be interviewed and read a few poems, is he chooses a poem by another Texas poet to read. Well, the poem I'm about to read is about another Texas poet. So this Texas laureate, Larry Thomas, chose my poem because it's about another Texas poet called Walter Macdonald, who's retired now from Texas Tech, who for decades was one of the preeminent Texas poets. But I'll read this, and it came from a conversation I had with Walt. He wouldn't write the poem himself, so I wrote his poem for him. He lived in Lubbock. He has poems about cattle and ranches and that, and they showed up at his door and unloaded the cameras and said, "When are we going to the ranch?" He says, "I don't have a ranch." You know, he knew enough about cows and land and all, but they filmed an episode, but he said their hearts weren't in it, and they just packed up and went wherever they were. They may have been out of Dallas at that time. You know, then left and never ran the episode. So, you know, it's poetry sometimes. You know. We're used to being overlooked. So this poem is called "The Texas Country Reporter Interviews the Famous Poet." Come in, you said when the van pulled to the curb. Iced tea? Just a cameraman and a lone reporter a long way from Dallas. Inside it's soft leather, AC, pictures, family, friends, you in uniform with your foot on the hub of a jet, gazing off toward the wild blue. Is this the street one asks where you were caught in the tar, where your brother rescued you? How far to the ranch, your herd, he wonders, putting down his sweating glass. So it's stories, not poems, they have come for. To see where the squirrels squeezed through the soffit and rampaged the attic all winter. They want to see for themselves where heat lightning struck the old bull, all the made-up things, the windmill with damaged blades, sucker rods complaining loudly in the wind, a pond where wild ducks might float by, barbed wire stretching to the horizon, the trough where you baptized the dog. There are no horses or cows, no mules, no ranch to confess to. The camera stays unpacked, disappointed. It wants not exactly lies, but not the truth either. Imagine them, you want to say. But these are men who cannot imagine something they've already seen. And because the sky is overcast and irregular, they can't even trace the clouds with a finger. They are pointless, the sky seems to say, so you don't have to, as you envisage the door of an unreal barn closing.
It's a great poem. I love that poem. Well, Joseph Campbell, who before his death in the late 90s was considered the world's foremost mythologist, and he was a wonderful storyteller and collected all the world's great stories. But he said, when people say they're looking for the meaning of life, what we're really saying is we're looking for the experience of being alive in this world. That's the meaning of life. And my question to you is, do you think poetry helps with that?
Yes, Houseman in Terence This Is Stupid Stuff, a wonderful poem, says, you know, if you want to be happy, drink. If you want to be prepared for the embittered hour, read and write poetry.
And Borges said, whatever you're looking for is out there looking for you too. But he said it in Spanish, and it was much better. But, you know.
And as Houseman says, the bad thing about drinking is you have to do that every day. With poetry, you can carry the lesson with you. You don't have to read a poem every day. It might help, but you don't. It shouldn't kill you, though.
Jennifer Ravey, when did you know you were creative? When did you know you wanted to write? At what age? I'll be empirical.
My mom always tells a story. I never slept as a child.
You never what?
Never slept. And she would sit outside my room and write down the stories that I would tell myself and then have me illustrate them. So I think in a sense, I've always been creative.
You had faith in that?
Faith in that? No.
Mm-hmm. I
mean, I do, like you said, there's something mysterious about it. But to me, curiosity adds to creativity, but I think as Richard said, if you don't do it, it doesn't matter if you're creative. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Rob Clark, one of the world's great architects, when did you know you were creative? Did you have faith in that knowledge?
Yeah, I think I realized I was creative early, suggested by my parents I not be, so I wouldn't be gay. You know, but it didn't obstruct anything, either way.
Well, some people think that creativity is that moment that comes outside yourself, that is not born from within, it's external, so you have no control over it. So if you didn't do it, say, well, it just didn't happen to me. But Philip Larkin, probably the best post-war British poet, World War II, said that novelists need to travel, poets need to recreate the familiar. Yeah, you need to have the eye for the detail and look at things in that way. You know, there's the whole world and all these things. My students, they say they don't have anything to write about. I said, you've been to public school. That's enough to write hundreds of poems.
Well, in a pedantic way, when I was a young man and I was trying to teach myself photography before we had the courses that we do in universities, now I became enamored of E.E. Cummings, like a lot of people. But I really loved his essay, Advice to a Young Poet. And I still have that on my darkroom wall, where he said, if you want to be a poet, you have to work harder than anybody who isn't a poet can possibly imagine. Well, that appealed to the romantic side of my nature, and I changed the word, as I always did. If you want to be a photographer, you have to work harder than anybody who isn't one can possibly imagine. And I think it works in just about every profession. You change the words.
I'll read.
Oh, you think about them.
I'm going to read a poem about school since I mentioned that. This really happened, not to me, but I was the witness to this occurring. It's called Burning Love. In the 5th grade, while the rest of us craved baseball and candy, Glenn fell in love. During recess, he kissed a girl behind the trees. She had begun to grow breasts, though he was too young to do much about that or them. He was enchanted instead by her name and wrote Sue again and again on book covers. He daydreamed about marriage and history and math. He even scratched her name on a mesquite skin with a fork he swiped from his lunchroom tray. Then, in what passed for passion in those days, he fashioned the heads of kitchen matches into a tattoo on his wrist. She gave off more heat than light. Unimpressed by the blisters that spelled her irrevocably into a scar, she kissed another boy on the school bus home. Glenn cried when he heard. He tried not to, but he did. First heartbreak is always sad. Still, he sensed how much worse it might have been. Then he called himself lucky. So lucky he hadn't fallen for Elizabeth.
But within that, you notice how much detail there is, specific detail, to bring you around to that. The Belgian architect, we're all famous, Mies van der Rohe, we all have heard less is more. We tell students that in terms of design in the art department, don't waste your space, et cetera, et cetera. He also was famous for saying, and it's not quite as well known, God is in the details. Same in poetry, same in dance, same in photography, same in painting, same in architecture.
I have a question on the other end of the creativity road, which is, could each of you share a story of when you faced your most creative block?
Oh, yeah.
Forever. I have trouble because my main job is to be a teacher, and so I don't write every day. And when there are busy times on campus, I try to get back to writing. I have to knock the rust off sometimes, and it just won't come sometimes. You have to write through. You have to write through the bad stuff, to get anywhere. It never comes in pure form. At least not to me. I pretty much have to earn most of the poems. I sympathize with students who say I have nothing to write about. They can't think of it. It seems because their life seems very unimportant to them, but it's every bit as important as anyone else's.
Yeah, that's good.
So they go off and bake an apple pie or do something else instead. Or I don't have a swimming pool. I don't golf anymore, and I don't have any. I've run out of habits except to write and read. My wife wants to say something. She's going to tell them. But before she does, told her, I'll repeat to you, if I'd known being married was so much fun, I'd had 6 wives by now.
Thank you. Now, I know that you rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and what I wanted to ask was to ask Keith, do you ever take a photograph that is a fabulous subject and somehow you didn't get it right? Do you go back to the same subject or the same place or the same? Well,
yeah, I understand what you're saying. The short answer is yes. It doesn't happen very often. It happens often that I don't have the muse with me. It's not quite what I had hoped. And that makes the ones that are more than you expected, and sometimes they aren't expected, even more precious. But yeah, I've tried to do that. But it's really interesting to me, because if you don't go back and try and recreate what you missed visually, it may be different in the literary world. You're a little different, the day's a little different, things are a little different, and the thing is moved an iota or you're not standing in the same oblique angle place. You know, you're just 4 inches off, and it just doesn't quite work.
So you really can't edit your work the way a writer or a poet can, or a
No,
filmmaker?
well, no, but I will tell you briefly that I'm embroiled right now, because it's all coming to a head, with a 50-year retrospective book, and I've been going through 50 years of my work. And that's a really wonderful privilege and a joy to do. I mean, and I'm just appalled at some of the things that I did. And I'm just appalled at how goofy I was, you know, thinking in those days. And every now and then I think, my God, that's wonderful. Why didn't I print that? You know, it's just a really strange...
And everybody has the experience. It's not the way we left it. Even though nothing has literally changed, we have. So it's never where we left it. You go back and look at a movie, you thought, this is going to be the best movie you've ever seen, and it's changed.
Yeah, and I mean, I bet it's happened in everybody's life. But I want to give my answer to your question. I had been making images, and I'd worked. I loved the work, and I still do. Probably 15, 18 years. And I really felt I was making derivative images, because being self-taught, anytime I could get my hands on a book, I thought it was like the Holy Grail. And I would just pore over the book, and I'd go make photographs in that manner. It was a good way to learn, unless you were in a scholarly environment and had Prince Thomas as a teacher, or Christopher or Donna, et cetera, et cetera. That's how I learned. And then I went to a lecture at the Galveston Galveston Opera House, and because a playwright named Horton Foote was giving a lecture, and I always liked his plays. They took place in a small town. I lived in a small town. They were about ordinary people, and they were about the things that visited ordinary people's lives. And I sat there, and it was a panel discussion in the Opera House, and it was, by my standards, forgive me, a snoozerama. It was academics, complete with elbow patches, you know, using 5-syllable words, talking about Horton's plays, when 2-syllable word would work just fine. And like your Heidelberg question, I didn't understand it. Heisenberg, yeah, there you go. But here's the point. When it became Horton's time to talk, there was this lovely older silver-headed, navy blue jacket, gray pants, portly man with a mellifluous voice. And he said, you know, when I was a boy growing up in Wharton, Texas, he says, you know, it's agricultural. But I had a teacher, and I told the teacher, you know, I think I want to be an actor, or I want to write. And he said, well, Horton, that's going to be difficult in this community, because that's not what people really think a lot about. He said, but I can tell you, if you want to be an actor, or you want to be a writer, or you want to be whatever it is, he said, you have to know a couple things. You have to know the history of your medium. You have to know everything that's come before you, on whose shoulders you stand on. And I thought, yeah. And I sort of know that. And he said, and you have to be a product of your own times. You have to make your art or writing in your own generational way, not what was always done in the past. And I thought, yeah, I know that too. And he said, so I left, and I went to Pasadena Playhouse, and then I went to New York, and things happened, and all kinds of things happened. He said, and I worked for about 8 or 10 years, and then I decided those things were true, but they weren't enough for me. He said, I found that I had to belong to a place. And all the work he did from then on, winning the National Medal of Arts, Pulitzer, Academy Award for Tender Mercies, everything he did was revolved around that small town and those people and those stories that he grew up hearing. Now that I'm older, anyway, I sat up bolt right in the Opera House, and I thought, oh my God, you know, oh my God. Here I am thinking I have to go to New Guinea or someplace to make a photograph that somebody's going to look at, something exotic, something great. Why don't I just try and belong to my place? and play like I'd never been here before. And I didn't know the animals, I didn't know the people, I didn't know the religions. You know, and you think about it, you got white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, you got African-American imagination, Vietnamese industry, you got everything, Cajuns, rednecks, peckerwoods, everything in this little corridor. So for a long, and I went back and I just was on fire. I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to photograph the soil on which I come from. It was a good starting point. I don't do that anymore, but it was a great starting point. And if you're young in this group, I think nowadays it's a useful thing. You don't have to belong to a geographical place, but I think it's good to think about belonging to something. You know, put down roots and build your work from that. Themes, stories, you know. I mean, how does a creative impulse visit you nowadays?
Well, we were talking about place. We had lunch the other day, and I said, once I leave a place, I can better write about it, because it seems fixed then. And, you know, kind of like looking at a photograph.
Yeah,
now, I do write poems sometimes about Beaumont, and you take pictures sometimes.
I do.
Beaumont. And,
but nowadays, I try to make them look like they could be made anywhere in the world, not just Beaumont. So, not grounded in a place.
You have a. You told I haven't seen it. You said you had a hurricane photo.
I do have a. It's not a very good one, but
well,
you know. So. Well, you have a hurricane poem.
Yeah, I do.
Well, we were talking about that. I'll show you my hurricane photograph. It was the one that devastated us 11 years ago, not the one that just rained and rained. But my mentor is 87 years old, and he's a sculptor, and I went over to help him, or to see how he'd fared, and his sculpture all over his yard, and fallen trees and fallen over sculptures and so on and so forth. And we were putting things together and standing up, and he was trying to cut trees and so on and so forth. And this big 8-foot man, who was Jesus, had his arms outstretched. It's backlit. That's the wrong light to use. It silhouettes things. You don't ever want to backlight something. What's more, the light strikes your lens directly. It causes flare. You see that circular motif at the bottom? That's a no-no. And I knew it. But it just seemed fitting for the mayhem we had just experienced. And so that's my hurricane photograph. And I thought of it in a nanosecond as hope. That ain't a suitable subject for art sometimes, but it's certainly a suitable subject for our lives. It was about hope. Okay, that's mine.
I'll do a hurricane poem, which was appeared on a website called Poets Reading the News. All the poems are about current events, but so they're mostly about our president. So we did have a hurricane that interrupted for a week or two, and then that has been picked up by the San Antonio Express News. They're running every Sunday. They're running a hurricane poem for 9 weeks. They started last week. Mine, I think, is the last one. So sometime in January, and you won't have to go look at it because I'll read the poem for you. Katie Hirth, our new hire, a wonderful young poet, award-winning poet, also has one in there. So I have 9 poems. We have 2 from Lamar. Mine is called Alive in Captivity After the Flood. There are lots of ways to be blind, but you can smell water even when you can't read a map. Volcanic beachheads, a wild trench, ambiguous lines of terrain, each divided by the transitive property of water. Admire the math of a cornfield maze, the farmer who dusts his hands in fulfillment while the silo leans forward as if it has something to say. Beyond it, tamed and peaceful, a disused church stands, its eyes broken like the last panes of heaven. You've seen this, and through birthday binoculars, you've seen other scapes, ructions at the water hole in a world so flat everything seems in view. Hyenas, vultures, herds of elegant ungulates. Home, it's all possum haw and crawdad palace. I like the land, animals, birds, this place. Still, I wonder what it wants me to know. So I listen when the water speaks. I look when it tells me to, but mostly I go when it says go.
Golden right. How does the creative impulse visit you? You're a wonderful choreographer, dancer. I'm just curious. How and when?
I don't think it's ever the same. I think sometimes it's an image. Sometimes I walk past something and I see some fog and a light behind it, like we were talking backlit, and that inspired something. It depends on. I really struggle because I don't ever feel that there's a destination with that. I always find a journey, and during that journey, those inspirations come to me in different ways. And so then I try to fulfill that based off of what that inspiration is. Sometimes it's off of a conversation with a student. Sometimes it's having a moment sitting at home with my wife. Sometimes it's a matter of dancing myself or reading something. I don't think I've ever had the same inspiration for two pieces, and that's why I don't think many of my pieces of choreography or things that I've done have ever really looked very much the same, you know.
So you don't think, am I correct in saying you don't think of it in an empirical way? It's not a specific thing that's going to happen at a specific time?
No, and sometimes I have to go find a piece of paper or an electronic notepad to say, I got to write that down. You know, I really want to explore this. I want to see what I can satisfy with that. You know, I don't.
How important is it to you to have a goal? Brandy Hamilton, what is your goal? You come back to this school after 20 years in the Air Force. You're a major, and now you want to be in the arts. That's a big deal. What's your goal?
Very big different goal to be in galleries and museums and to have a point of view and use my experience to have something to say.
What do you want to say?
Still trying to figure that out.
That's why you're in this school. You ought to stick around. We're going to help you. Okay.
I've got an observation.
Okay.
I think creativity is not just the domain of the artist, but I think it happens in children. I think it happens in university professors. I think it happens in chefs. I think it happens in scientists. And I think we have to expand the discussion to see that, in fact, artists are, in fact, incredibly creative, but this is something that affects everyone in their daily life.
Well, I agree 100% with you. We all do. Yeah.
How you take a road. If I go to the wellness center to try that, am I going to take the straight path? Or am I going to go explore another street or something like that? I think creativity is something that affects us all. It's not just artists. So.
Well, it brings me, would you like to read a poem? I have a question I'd like to pose.
Oh, go ahead. Maybe you'll make me think.
Well, this is a brave person to answer this. Do you think schools can occasionally kill creativity? I see a lot of nodding heads. Can anybody give an example? Because I think it happens too.
Keith, you have a hand over here.
Yes, sir.
If you've ever been in an English class in the last 10 years, they started, they want a basic format for like everything.
In terms of writing?
In terms of writing, in terms of public speaking, basically, if you're going to somehow be creative with it, they want some way to grade it, and the grade is if you follow some path.
That's beautifully put and fascinating. And I see a couple nodding heads amongst presumably your colleagues. So, well, as we say in the arts, huh?
Don't you think public schools value conformity over creativity?
I do. I personally do, but I was curious to see what other people think. I don't think they mean to do that sometimes, but it's deadly.
But I think sometimes it's necessary. Like in some ways, like you can't. I think it was like Troutman's class for drawing.
That's why I laughed.
No, but you have to be able to, like he said, have something to judge. You have to be able to teach and to know what needs to be taught. You have to know what's not there or what is there to be able to teach. And so I think that requires some of the same assignments. Everybody has to do this and do that. But I think that happens in the beginning stages of school, and as you you know, progress into the, you know, junior or senior years of school and into grad school and things like that, is where you have more opportunity to expand and to really explore that creativity and that, you know, what is it you want to do or you want to say, but you have to have that foundation, or I don't think you'd ever really get to that place.
Well, that's not unreasonable. That's an interesting observation. I mean, in the arts, we generally are very nurturing the first semester, and by the third semester, we curse at you. So, you know, are you out of your mind?
Sometimes they tell you that, you know, think outside the box to encourage that, but we know what's outside the box. John Wilkes Booth is outside your box, you know.
I think a lot of people are touching on this, but I was wondering if the two of you, do you sometimes struggle with that tension between necessary structure, work, and reason versus intuition and inspiration that sometimes happens while you're working? Because the structure does seem to be necessary, you know, those patterns of work activities and different things.
Well, yes, to some extent, but they're not all, they should not be, we all agree, I think, all-encompassing. And it's a balance. In my 3 decades here now, I've found that, you know, probably like everybody else, almost every single class is different. There's a different makeup of interest.
You put it in a frame, or you write it in musical notes, or you put it in words, or you put color, you have some structure of some sort. I mean, there's a lot to do with those. Yeah, so I don't worry about. I mean, I sometimes, and it comes early for me. I sort of know about how long the poem might be. And, I'll find out soon enough if it's going to be a rhymed poem. But I mean, that just sort of seems intuitive.
If I taught your course, that has to be structured. That's art history. It's a lot of material you have to impart. If it's a studio class, it's a little bit different because a lot of that's they're working in class and you're walking around, and a lot of times in that kind of environment, it's not the answers you provide so much as the questions you ask them. Yeah. You know, that kind of thing, and what you say about it, and try not to make them in your own little mode, that kind of thing. But it.
Don't you think creativity is about escaping the structure? So you
yeah,
have
to a lot of
and
extent.
you escape the structure, and that's where you find the new form, right?
And not being afraid to fail. I mean, you know, I think we do ourselves a disservice by not encouraging them sometimes when they have failed on this. That's a great job. You tried there. Let's do it again. Print sucks, but it's good, man. Let's reprint it, you know.
But the fear, too.
David?
I ask my students, and I teach the advanced poetry writing class now, and the audience not so much don't know this, but I can ask the poet, what's the best thing about your poem and the worst? And they know automatically. They go right to it. They know where they've done all right.
But isn't sometimes that wrong moment in a poem the most beautiful element that maybe turns it into something new?
But it's not going to stay the way it is.
Okay, that's
probably.
It's a little
it's probably, and there's always, accident is very important. You know, we have to open ourselves up to the possibility of accident.
Well, I would like to just interfere here a little bit, but I would say that, you know, when I came up with this Cardinal conversation idea, and Ken and I batted it around, and he started out talking about breaking the rules, but, you know, I had to offer some kind of structure to help people get started, and, you know, after that,
that's creativity. It morphs. It evolves. That's Darwin's theory.
Art, a lot of times the best work happened when somebody made a mistake, because then they had to rethink. They went in a way that they weren't thinking it was going to happen, and maybe making a mistake is part of your creative process.
Well, I think serendipity in science. I mean, the greatest scientific discovery
were mistakes, or just you know,
for something else,
or was one failure after another, and just keeping and trying things. Most of us all know these things innately, and the best teachers, I think, encourage that kind of thing. But if you're a student, and you're a smart student, which clearly all of you are. you still have to do the work. You know, you have to be brave.
William Blake says,
you just have to be
fool
brave.
would persist in his folly, he'd become wise.
Then there's that.
The wrong thing, long enough.
I say be brave.
I think David has it.
David.
I was curious, going back probably 65 years in my life, I was taking a ceramics design course from Edens, Iceland. And I can remember our class.
That's a big deal.
We're doing teapots. And here were probably 25 people, and there were 20-something of one style and 2 or 3 exceptions. And I wondered what was happening in the education today. You know, I mean, it looked, 20 of them could have been done by the same person.
Mm-hmm.
They were 1 or 2 different that I always looked at as, you know, well, I was one of the different ones.
I don't think that would hold true today. I think in our own department, our ceramics teacher would have 20 different things from 20 different students. But I know we're running out of time, and I'm preaching to the choir, but I would want to, particularly the young people, I want to say that everybody's creative. And it doesn't have to be in the arts. I mean, businessmen are creative, you know, artists obviously are trying to be creative, et cetera, et cetera. And a big part of that is not being afraid to fail and trying some things. I always say, listen, just be brave, just try it, okay? And that's not rocket science, and that's not original, but it's born out of practical experience. You know, you have to try things. If you're working for somebody else, you please them. You try and structure what they want. If you're working for yourself, that's a different ball game. And sometimes that's self-serving, but that's a little harder because you don't have those parameters that you have to work within. You have to try and evolve the poem or put the words together. And sometimes there's dissonance, you know, and sometimes they're beautiful. That's what I think.
Jerry, we have just a minute. Do you have one more poem you'd like to?
Oh, okay. I'll do one. I'll do another school poem. A few months ago, I looked at some old pictures, and I saw my picture of my 3rd grade English teacher. Actually, 2nd. I made 3rd in the poem because I didn't think I was precocious. It was being creative, and I didn't know it at the time, but I was in the 1st year of her teaching, and she was still alive. She was living somewhere in Kansas, way up in her 80s now. That's how old I am, you know, way up there. And so I thought I'd write a poem about her. It's called Primer. In the 3rd grade, I fell in love with my teacher. In indecency, I know, but Miss Heusinger's eyes opened and closed in our sunny classroom, well, like a pupil. Aside from a single afternoon of cleaning the chalk trays, she was a woman whom I almost never stood near. She married, moved away. It was not her policy, I learned, not to leave no child behind. A substitute finished the term. That is how a heart learns to break. Then life repeats itself. The trouble with redundancy is there's just too much of it. Years later, she is likely divorced, abandoned by a man who wasn't good enough or has died. But she is still one of them, the ones we are doomed to remember, and call it what you will, never quite quit loving. You may remember what your first love said when you met, but you couldn't see the future, how she held it like an eraser in her uplifted hand.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just a little remembrance.
Oh, boy.
Nice.
Booty.
Swag.
Swag. Booty's something else, isn't it? Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming. Let's give these guys a round of applause.